Now he could be putting America into a forever war, but he thinks, to hell with that. He's the president now. They can support him or not. He has got his agenda for a second term, which is all about legacy.
Just hours after the capture of Venezuelan leader Nicolas Maduro, President Donald Trump announced that American energy companies would return to the country with billions of dollars to invest, putting oil at the centre of his dramatic move against the Maduro regime. The president said that US firms would rebuild Venezuela's crumbling oil infrastructure and unlock what he says is a tremendous amount of wealth.
We have to have energy that's real energy, not where they're getting 4% and 5% of the energy out of the ground. You take a look. It was such a disaster. So what's going to happen with Venezuela, I think, over the next period of a year is going to be a great thing. And the people of Venezuela will be the biggest beneficiaries.
So why is Venezuelan oil so central to this moment? Why is it so valuable? And what could happen now? I am joined by Dr. Adi Imsirovic, a former oil trader and now academic and director of the Surrey Clean Energy Consultancy. Good afternoon, Adi.
Good afternoon, Jane.
Thanks so much for being here this afternoon. I think it's really important to get an understanding of what this just means in terms of the oil industry, because Donald Trump isn't even pretending that this isn't about oil, is he? What does his promise of US energy companies returning to run oil in Venezuela actually mean in practical terms? Can he do it? Is it even feasible?
Well, in theory, it's feasible. It's very questionable whenever Donald Trump says anything, whether he actually thought about it very much beforehand. But three big companies, particularly two of them, ExxonMobil and Chevron, have been in the country for many, many decades. Chevron in particular still has an operation in the country. Now, just to put things in a perspective for your listeners, Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the world. They're about 350 to 400 billion barrels. That's absolutely massive. Unfortunately, Venezuelan oil is very, very difficult to produce. It's very heavy. You almost have to shovel it out of the ground. And it's very high sulfur, which has to be removed before you actually can use any of those products. So technology is extremely important for producing that oil. And sanctions over time have forced Venezuela actually to reduce their production from 3.5 million barrels every day to only about maybe 700,000 barrels a day at the moment recently. And that's because of lack of technology. Now, whether the companies that I've mentioned are going to go back in is very much a function of the final political settlement in the country, which is far, far from clear at the moment. I think your correspondents mentioned early on that, the vice president is sort of in charge. The US don't want to have anyone on the ground, but Trump wants to run the country. How that works in reality is very hard to know. But to actually increase production of Venezuelan oil, massive investments are needed because we are talking about decades of neglect because the Maduro and Chavez before him regimes have used PDVSA, which is the national oil company, as a milking cow for the ruling party. So never investing any money back into the production and refining of oil. So a lot of these refineries, pipelines, load ports, they're in a very, very poor state, and they need billions of dollars of investment over a very long period of time to increase that production.
As you mentioned, I mean, like much of what Trump says, there is a kind of tiny kernel of truth in what he says at root, particularly regarding the US's previous earnings from Venezuelan oil. You mentioned that in previous times they, produced about 3.5 million barrels. And also, in the 1970s, it was an OPEC, and American companies were earning a lot of money, weren't they, from Venezuelan oil?
Well, absolutely. We're talking about the oligopolies of so-called Seven Sisters that ruled the roost in the international oil markets. And Venezuela was one of those countries producing and where the sort of big oligopoly of international oil companies was benefiting out of most of that production. Oil prices were, I don't know, $1, $1.50, $2. in the late 60s, early 70s. And those were the prices on which these oil companies were paying taxes and royalties to the producing governments. So yes, I think Trump very often liked to see sort of the US going to those old days of sort of almost neo-colonial situation.
Now, China has been the main buyer of Venezuelan oil for the last decade. Trump gave his assurance yesterday that they would still be able to get oil from the country. But do you think that there's now a danger if the US does somehow take over the control of Venezuelan oil, that it could become a bit of a trigger point for future conflict with sort of other big powers wanting to buy the country's oil?
Absolutely not. International oil markets are very, very perfect and they work extremely well. And if you read social media, there's so much rubbish out there. Please don't trust most of the things that you read. I've seen headlines that it's going to be major shift in geopolitics in the last few decades and whatnot. For a start, even if China bought the whole Venezuelan exports, all of it, it would be less than 5% of its overall import. So it's a drop in the ocean, absolutely nothing. China does like the quality of Venezuelan oil, but so does India, so do other countries as well. A very good substitute for Venezuelan oil for China is Canadian oil, and Canada is exporting more and more of its own oil into Asia and particularly China. So I don't think it's very important in any way. Also, the other thing that Donald Trump, one of the ideas in social media was this Donald Trump sort of did this to sort of make it harder for China to get oil. Absolutely not. I mean, the all US had to do was to lift sanctions and actually let their own companies buy the oil. It would be a hell of a lot cheaper than doing this special military operation he did.
But what are the implications for other countries? I'm thinking particularly here of Cuba. It's already been struggling with blackouts and it's been on the verge of collapse at points because of the blockades of the Venezuelan oil already that have it made life very, very difficult for Cuba. What will it mean for them now if the US is controlling it to a greater extent?
It'll be very hard. For Cuba, I think you're absolutely right there. Cuba is a country that was basically getting aid in terms of oil from Venezuela. Very often in terms of products rather than crude oil, and they are going to have a very hard time. And that is one geopolitical point where Trump administration can turn the screw on Cuba. And given the Venezuelan policy is being led by the Secretary Mike Rubio, who spent decades, he's originally Cuban, working against Chavez originally, and I think has designs on Cuba, could have political consequences. And let me just say one very important point. From the oil point of view, current situation in Venezuela has very, very little short-term impact, and that can be seen in the futures market. It's actually market has budged very little. It's dropped like 9 pennies, 9 cents a barrel, absolutely nothing. So the short-term consequences are very, very small. The long-term consequences, what now we're talking about Cuba and other countries, are potentially massive. They're actually very, very big. The US president has a growing appetite for military adventures. It legitimizes, actions, but perhaps in Ukraine, in Gaza, Iran. And you know what, Jane? Blocking a hostile country, decapitating its leadership, it would be a wonderful template for China against Taiwan as well, wouldn't it?
Absolutely, absolutely.
These are long-term consequences.
Yeah, thank you so much, Adi. It's great to get your insight into what this means in terms of oil. I'd like to bring in Sarah Baxter now, who's the director of the Marie Colvin Center for International Reporting. Good afternoon, Sarah.
Hello, Jane.
Sarah, we've been discussing this story throughout the show and getting different perspectives, but how is it going down in America on the ground? How are both Republicans and Democrats and the public at large reacting to this intervention?
Well, I think they're a bit stunned, really, by this new Donroe Doctrine, as it's called, as opposed to the Monroe Doctrine, which is a revival of colonial imperialist attitudes towards South America. Now, I think if it's a sort of one and done policy, Americans are all for it, a bit like the strikes on Iran took place without much opposition. just that idea, the decapitation, the assassination of General Soleimani in Trump's first administration. That was a sort of one-off shock and awe event. But this capture of Maduro, who's staying just a few miles away in Brooklyn at the moment, which is kind of shocking to think about, is fraught with so much uncertainty that both Republican and Democrat lawmakers have not been saying very much. In fact, Democratic hopefuls for 2028 have been remarkably silent, apart from Pete Buttigieg, who's been making a rather obvious statement about, what does this mean for, what is he trying to distract from problems at home? Is that what the president's up to? So everyone's trying to assess Donald Trump's motives. This idea that Trump is going to, or America's going to run Venezuela, that's caused a lot of disquiet on the MAGA side. So you see MAGA bloggers voicing hesitation about this, or even, reminding people of what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Well, that's a very good point, isn't it, Sarah? Because America does not have the greatest track record on what happens on day two.
Yeah, the way that America went into Iraq, sent the tanks rumbling up that highway and toppled Saddam was extraordinary. And then the problems began. So, people are remembering that pottery store rule, you break it, you own it. The government of Venezuela has been broken, or at least the leader has. Now we'll see what deals are done with the vice president. And does that mean that America now owns what happens next in Venezuela? And I think both, so all sides are kind of unhappy. Venezuelans, exiles, have been celebrating Miami. There was a small crowd outside Brooklyn shouting that Maduro was a scumbag. But the mayor of New York, the new mayor, Zoran Mamdani, in one of his first acts was to ring Donald Trump and say he opposed this kind of intervention.
Well, that's really interesting, Sarah, isn't it? Because Mamdani did do a lot of charming of Donald Trump last month before he was inaugurated. But is he one of the few politicians who's actually put his head above the parapet and actually spoken out directly to Donald Trump so far?
Yeah, he really is, or at least the first that we've heard. Obviously, people like Marjorie Taylor Greene, a MAGA fan turned critic of Donald Trump, have said this is not what MAGA voted for. Nobody ever thought when they voted for Donald Trump, only just over a year ago, that he was going to lead these kind of wars of conquest. So that was definitely not in the MAGA mirror. So there is a degree of astonishment, bewilderment, and apprehension, I'd say, about what happens next. There are all kinds of theories being spun. If it works out, will this revive Trump's diminishing support among Hispanic communities, particularly if there's a knock-on effect on Cuba as well, as your previous speaker was talking about. If Trump seems to be acting on a sort of domino theory here, that you could topple Venezuela and then topple Cuba. Would that bring Hispanic voters to his side? I'd say that's very uncertain, certainly risky, depending on the level of chaos that ensues. If it's neatly done, if there is a plan, if there is a deal with people in Venezuela right now, and with people like the Vice President Delcy Rodriguez, perhaps it can go more smoothly than people feared. So there's this kind of wary watch and wait. There's certainly not any kind of triumphalism about this act at all.
No. And as you said, Sarah, it's been odd that people from the political community have been so quiet so far. I don't know whether we should read that as people are still digesting it, or a certain level of trepidation and fear about speaking out against Donald Trump. But they won't be able to stay silent for long, will they? It's first day back at school tomorrow for most people in politics. Do we expect that people will have to make some noise and put their stake in the ground on this as of tomorrow?
Well, you'd think, wouldn't you? But Congress has been remarkably supine and prefers to say nothing rather than to go up against Donald Trump. And I think that any 2028 Democratic hopefuls for president are wary, because they're a bit worried it might turn out to be a success. So, and the problem is Maduro himself has no fans. So very few people support that kleptocratic ex-Marxist regime. It would be ridiculous to describe it as Marxist right now, because it's, for good or ill, it bears no resemblance to Marxism. It's very kleptocratic and dictatorial. And Maduro himself, is not considered the legitimate president. Same time, Donald Trump has shown absolutely no, he hasn't mentioned the word democracy once,
No.
and has shown no interest in opposition leaders in Venezuela. So he wants to do a deal with people who can deliver for America. He's put Delcy Rodriguez, the vice president, on notice that he's happy to work with her if she does everything that Donald Trump, wants. And he wants, he's really, I don't think he cares that much, to be honest, about his MAGA base anymore. Donald Trump is in his second term as president. He needed them to get back into power. He's broken with some of them over the Epstein files, and now he could be putting America into a forever war. But he thinks, to hell with that, he's the president now. They can support him or not. He has got his agenda for a second term, which is all about legacy.
Yeah, which is it's an astonishing way to go into only his second year. Not even that. His end of his first year. Yeah, absolutely.
It's boggling, Jane. We've got 3 years of this to go, minimum.
Well, we will be talking to you many, many times over the next 3 years, I know. Thank you so much for your insights as always, Sarah. That's Sarah Baxter, who's director of the Marie Colvin Center for International Reporting. And before that, you heard from Dr. Adi Imsarovic, who's a former oil trader and now an academic and director of the Surrey Clean Energy Consultancy.